if it takes this compute scaling view seriously, maybe like each order of magnitude of effective compute scale up gets you some additional percentage of tasks that are automated in the economy until you've automated everything. Even if you do automate AI R&D, it's not clear how much that gets you. Like if you think the scaling of compute has been the key driver of the rapid software progress over the past 10 to 15 years, then you wouldn't necessarily be resolving that bottleneck by just scaling the researcher population much faster. Extrapolation just doesn't work very well. In 2015, 2016, self-driving cars were maybe the most exciting application. Well, 10 years later, the story is the LLMs and reasoning models. And so OpenAI forecasts $100 billion per year of revenue by 2029. But that's not anywhere near enough for the economic feedback loops to become intense enough. If you want this sort of feedback loop that goes from increased economic output to more AI developments, more scaling, then you need the economic output to actually be scaling quite rapidly. What matters is what are the broader incentives and forces? What are those forces pushing AI to be like?
Welcome to the Future of Life Institute podcast. My name is Gus Stocker, and I'm here with Ege Erdil. Ege, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Do you want to introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. I'm a senior researcher at Epoch AI. I've been there for maybe like a couple of years by this point. I work on like a bunch of different subjects, from economics of AI to like feasibility of distributed training to like limits to energy efficiency of hardware. It's kind of hard to like list all the topics like off the top of my head.
I would say anything interesting in AI, Epoch is like answering the deep questions about that. It's superb stuff.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that we have like a couple of different like divisions by this point, where we have a team that just works on collecting data, and we have all these data products like where you can go to our website and see all the models that have been, like all the large scale models that have been trained, I don't know, since whatever, 2015. You can see how much compute they used and how much, like we have these big databases where you can see who published them, when did they publish the model, how much compute do we think they used, what was the size of the training data set, And we are also now developing a benchmarking hub where we do our own evaluations of benchmarks. Right now, it's still kind of limited in scope, like we evaluate mostly math or reasoning benchmarks right now, but we're hoping to expand that in the future. And then we have like a research arm where we publish like reports and blog posts, and now we also have a newsletter, which I'm mostly responsible for. And I would say I'm involved in some of the other things as well, but I mostly work on the research side of the organization.
Yeah. One of your newest outputs is this GATE paper, or interactive model, which is GATE modeling the trajectory of AI and automation. What is GATE?
So there was this previous line of work done by Tom Davidson at OpenFail, where he took this, he basically translated the idea of compute scaling into an setting of an economic model, where he says, okay, there's some spectrum of tasks in the economy. If it takes this compute scaling view seriously, maybe like each order of magnitude of effective compute scale up, so that's allowing for software progress as well as just physical compute scaling, maybe each order of magnitude gets you some additional percentage of tasks that are automated in the economy until you've automated everything. And so there's like a certain slope where like you start automating tasks at a certain point, and then each order of magnitude you automate at maybe 10%, maybe 20% of the tasks in the economy. And then you can plug that assumption into like a relatively standard economic model, which turns it like into a non-standard model because most of these models don't have AI in them. But the rest of the model can be fairly standard, like the production function and how you assume that investments and consumption and whatever decisions in the economy are made, that can be fairly standard. And you can see what happens. So Tom Davidson's original model was also developed with Epoch's assistance, especially on the software side. And then we decided to develop GATE because that model had some shortcomings that we wanted to address. Maybe the biggest one was that in that model, economic decisions were hard-coded into the model. So they were not made in the standard way that this would typically be done in the economics literature, which would be that you would have some kind of utility or value function, and then you would be optimizing that to get like the best outcome, maybe under certain constraints. Instead of doing that, it was just a bunch of hard-coded rules with little parameters that I think the OpenFail folks just thought made sense. But that meant if you like use relatively extreme parameter values or something, the decisions would look very unreasonable. So that was the main motivation to like turn it into a standard economic model. This would also allow it to answer questions that the original model could not, because you could say, okay, like suppose that people assign like such and such credence to the like AGI being capable of full automation, let's say 10%. Like they are not sure, maybe they're uncertain. Then what should they do? Right? How much should they invest? There is this interesting possibilities where people might invest a bunch early if that helps them resolve the uncertainty. Like maybe they observe sort of the slope of the like automation curve to see like, okay, does this thing look like it's going to get to full automation? And maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. So they might update on that. And that might just inform their investment decisions, which we can observe in Gates, which you couldn't observe in this older framework because older decisions had been hard coded. So that's the basic motivation. It's important to not oversell the model in the sense that it's not really meant to be a predictive model. It's meant to be more like, just as I think Tom Davison's original model was not really meant to be predictive. And in fact, a lot of economics models are not really meant to be predictive. They are more meant to like show you what happens in this like simulated world where certain mechanisms and are built into the world and certain ones might be left out. But I think a lot of people's thinking about AI can be incoherent in the sense that they might believe things that are actually like incompatible with each other. And this kind of model helps clarify that.
Oh, well, what would be examples of that? What would be examples of some incoherent beliefs that fall apart in this model?
Sure. Like one example would be that you might have certain beliefs about like how fast software progresses, how fast hardware progresses, how much we're going to be able to scale up investment. Or for example, you might have beliefs about how fast we can double our stock of compute or our like number of fabs or whatever without running into severe constraints like serial time constraints or something. And you might not notice how aggressive the combination of those beliefs should actually make you about timelines. Like when you put all of that into a model, you might be surprised by how fast the automation actually happens. And like the main benefit of the model that I see is instead of you having to reason about this in your head, where you think, okay, like let me take this into account and this other thing and this other thing, and then let me just think about what would happen. You might have a bias in either direction when you're doing that. When you have the model, then you get to like, it just clarifies your thinking because either you have to disagree with the model's parameters and then you can delve into that. Okay, like I disagree with this parameter value. Then what evidence do we have about that particular parameter value? For example, one parameter that's important in the model is if we double our instantaneous research efforts, like if you have twice the number of researchers working on software R&D or hardware R&D, then how much faster would be making progress? At least like at that moment. And that is not clear. Like it's not necessarily that if you double your researcher stock, you make twice as fast progress because some things could just be difficult to parallelize. And then there's this penalty. And there might also be like, there's another question about what if you spend twice as much instead of have like literally twice as much researchers, in which case you might also have to think about the price impact. Or like maybe as you try spending more, the supply is kind of limited. So you're running up against like the constraints on the supply of competent researchers, in which case you might even get like less of an impact than you thought. And then you might notice that, oh, well, these parameters actually look quite important because if you could just, increase our spending by 10x and that got us like 10x faster software progress, maybe we would be doing that. And there's a separate effect about this fishing out where as you make progress in any domain of R&D, making further progress might become harder. So then you might, okay, like what is the size of that effect? So there are lots of things like this that might become relevant when you have a model like this and you do maybe a sensitivity analysis on the model. And you notice that some parameters are just very important for explaining the model's predictions about timelines, while maybe other ones don't matter that much. And then you can focus on the ones that do matter.
Which parameters are most important in this model?
Yeah, so I would say the assumptions about R&D matter quite a bit. Just the ones that I just mentioned, they are quite important. Other than that, the degree of complementarity in the economy at large matters because what this means is suppose that AI automates 50% of tasks in the economy instead of like 100%, right? How much of a boost to output does that give you? And if it gives you a lot, then that actually speeds up the process because you have this expanded pool of outputs that you can reinvest into more chips and more R&D and stuff like that. And that gets the entire feedback loop to happen faster, and it can end up shortening timelines. Other than that, I would say the what we would call like adjustment costs or time scales, like the serial time constraints and building a new fab, or maybe also just for ordinary kinds of physical capital investments, like building, power, infrastructure, and whatever, things like that. Like we don't know to what extent there are just serial time constraints in that process that like even if you try to do that much faster at our current level of technology or maybe slightly above it, we might not be able to do it that much faster. Like there's a question about the scaling curve. Like imagine you spend twice as much to get something done faster, like get a power plant to be built faster. Well, maybe that doesn't actually get you to the finish line that much faster than you might expect. Maybe there are just some limits there. And if there are limits, then those things can just become bottlenecks and sort of determine the overall pace at which you can continue scaling. Might become even more of an issue in the future when we will actually need to scale a lot of things. Like right now, I think we're only really having to construct data centers and maybe we are having to worry about power. But in the future, especially if you want this sort of feedback loop that goes from increased economic output to like more AI developments, more scaling, like feedback loops work, then you need the economic output to actually be scaling quite rapidly if you want that to be effective. And that's just going to be bottlenecked by these things if we can't do them. So it's quite important that we get to scale those things reasonably fast. So those parameters are also important.
If we look at the default parameters of the model, what are some predictions that comes out of that? Here I'm talking about AI investments, economic growth, scale up of compute, and so on.
Yeah, I think in the default parameter settings, we get to like another important parameter, of course, that I didn't mention is like how much effective compute is required to get to full automation. Like that's just always an important parameter because that sort of tells you how much distance is there that you have to cross. And if that number is very high, then like you might not see much economic impact from AI at all. But we have these arguments. There's whole literature about trying to estimate this number that came out of even before Tom Davis's model. There's the bioanchors report from AGI, which tries to estimate this number in a bunch of different ways. I think like it's not super plausible that this number is much larger than like what we allow for in the model. Like I think maybe it's like 10 to the 40 flop or something, effective flop. But I don't think it's like much larger than that because that ends up being in tension with the evidence we have from, say, evolution. The fact that human brains are effectively AGI, you could say, and they weren't like there's a certain amount of computation that went into producing the human brain as an artifact, and that is not like enormously more than 10 to 40 flop, according when you do back of the envelope estimate. So it's just not plausible. I think that the number is going to be much higher than that.
Yeah, evolution is probably less efficient than what we are like the machine learning process that we're engaged in.
That's right. I mean, there are some ways in which it might have advantages because it has a lot of serial time, which we don't have, and like it has hundreds of millions of years. Or why we usually need to do things in a much more compressed time frame, and it also has it has the ability to collect like real world data, which in a bunch of ways we might be bottlenecked by in the future. So, like, I don't want to like totally overstate the case, but I think something like this is probably true. And for the model, if we assume, like I think in mainline, it might be assume 10 to the 36 flop is the default parameter setting in the model. If you work with that and make the default assumptions about everything else, maybe you get timelines of 10 or 15 years.
Timelines to what?
Timelines of full automation. And we get timelines to like we begin seeing like quite a lot of economic impact even like 3 or 4 years out.
So full automation would be automation of all tasks in 2025 or automation of all tasks that humans are capable of, period?
I would say automation of all tasks humans are capable of, but basically any task that would bottleneck like any task such that if not automated, it would be a bottleneck on GDP.
You mentioned that this model is not really about predictions, but one thing that's interesting here is that if you play around with the parameters and change them slightly, it's difficult to avoid a picture in which we get more and more automation and perhaps faster than is acknowledged in general. How far can we bend the parameters and still see this picture of increased automation?
Well, I mean, the easiest parameter to mess with is the training requirements. I mean, if you make that high, then yeah, you can avoid whatever you want. But like the question is that plausible? And that's our question. Another question is software R&D. So I think this is like a tricky domain where we're using this abstraction of effective flop. Basically, we're assuming that like software progress just acts as sort of cuts the flop cost of reaching this, building the system that is capable of automation, or in fact, building any system, like any level of capability, you get this factor of cost saving. I think that's not necessarily a realistic model in a bunch of different ways. I mean, one of them is that software progress is not uniform across scales like that. Maybe it works more, and like maybe it's stronger for models that are like trained on more compute compared to less compute. But we don't know that. I don't think there's like decisive evidence about that. I would be more worried that like our software R&D estimates are very much calibrated. Like the return software R&D estimates are calibrated on domains like computer vision and language modeling at the current, something like the current level of capabilities. Maybe that means we are making progress towards this more general level of capabilities as well, that you might call AGI at the same rate. Maybe you're even going faster at there, but maybe we're going slower. So it's possible that we are making some kind of, like, for example, we wouldn't have said that if you looked at chess engines in the years, like in the 1990s, we were making some software progress. You wouldn't have said that software progress is actually getting us closer to AGI in a meaningful way, because that task just seems too narrow and too limited for us to use that, and maybe that's the case with AGI even today. Maybe like that would be, I think, the big argument if true, because if you take away the software R&D channel, that costs you quite a lot of orders of magnitude of effective flop. So it has the same effect of as if you increase the training requirements for AGI, because you lose the support from software R&D.
The progress we're seeing with language models seem different to me than the progress we saw with chess. Language models, we are making progress in a sense on generality too there. And do you think this indicates that we will see this kind of software feedback loop?
Well, it's more plausible than it is for chess. I'm not sure like how much to reason about. Like I'm not sure if the rates of progress are right, for example. Like I'm not sure if the rate of progress towards an AGI system is actually in line with the rates we estimate for language modeling, which are quite fast. Usually they're on the order of 3x per year or something like that. So like, is that right? I don't know. Like that rate couldn't have continued for a very long time, because if you extrapolate that backward, then you begin to reach these implausible conclusions. Like if you extrapolate that by 30, 40 years backward, then you get the conclusion that back in 1980 or 90 or whatever, we would have needed more compute to come up with the algorithm of the human brain than evolution used for like all of evolution. And that just doesn't seem plausible. So you can get around that by saying that we only have this fast rate of progress since like 2012 or 2015 or something, like basically only in the deep learning era. And that era is short enough that you don't have this implausible conclusion. But it does suggest something else that's interesting, because if the rate of progress has only lasted for a short time, and the short time period coincides with the period in which we've been rapidly scaling compute, it suggests a different thing that might become the obstacle, which is that maybe software progress is bottlenecked on using compute for experimentation. And that's why we are seeing this rapid progress in software just as we're scaling compute very aggressively, and why we didn't see this in other domains, or we didn't do the same thing, or we just relied on Moore's law effectively. Our budgets remain fairly fixed, and then we relied on Moore's law.
Yeah, we should expect progress to stall because we can't keep scaling compute at the rate that we're currently scaling compute.
Unless AGI is fairly soon. And then these other economic feedback loops can allow us to continue it. But yeah, assuming that doesn't happen, we're going to probably run out of runway to do that by like 2030 at current rates. And then compute scaling will have to slow down, just because, I mean, the spending on clusters and training rounds will become so exorbitant that we will not be able to scale it any further with our current pool of resources and willingness to invest. So I think it is an important question in general, anything aside from anything to do with gates, whether we reach this point before 2030 or not. I think there's a naive sense in which you should expect the arrival rates of AGI per year to be higher, or the emergence of new capabilities, novel capabilities, to be higher if we are going through more orders of magnitude of compute scaling. And so once scaling slows down, we might see advances in AI slow down. So it's an important question of what do we get until before that point.
What's the critical threshold we'll have to cross for progress to continue? Is it that AI will have to be good enough at doing AI research at that point?
Well, this is not an effect that's incorporating gates, because gate just assumes that the production function of ideas is the same production function as for the rest of the economy. We could have used different ones, but then you have different assumptions to make. Like that one also gets automated at a different rate than this other one, and then it's unclear. But like answering the question divorced from that particular model, I'm not sure if you can actually automate the process of AI R&D without also automating like much of the rest of the economy, at least the remote parts of the economy. Even if you do automate AI R&D, it's not clear how much that gets you if you can't automate the scaling of compute. Like if you think the scaling of compute has been the key reason behind the key driver of the rapid software progress over the past 10 to 15 years, then, well, I mean, you wouldn't necessarily be resolving that bottleneck by just scaling the researcher population much faster. There's a question about to what extent research efforts from humans or possibly AIs and compute used for experiments, and maybe to some extent real world data insofar as that matters, are complements. I would assume that these are complements, and if you just scale one of them by orders of magnitude while the other one just remains flat, then you're just going to get bottlenecked, and it's not going to actually like have as big of an impact as you might have thought. So I think it is really important for us to be able to like scale all of these things at once. And for that, we need the AI to be like start to produce a lot of economic value by end of decade if you don't want to run into the slowdown. Now, I think it's probably not going to happen in the sense that we are going to see a lot of economic value by like conventions of enormous technology. So OpenAI forecasts $100 billion per year of revenue by 2029. That's not a small number for one AI lab, but that's not anywhere near enough for the economic feedback loops to become like intense enough. So I think what's probably going to happen is we're going to get to end of decade and we're going to see a slowdown in progress. I think that's the most plausible outcome. And then we're going to have to get this like later. Maybe you're going to get this like 10 years later or after that, or maybe even later. I think people have like disagree about that, but I think the general view among people at Epoch is that this is not going to happen in like the next 5 years.
This is different from the leaders of the AI companies. You write about this view that's been shared by Dario Amodei and Demis Hassabis and Sam Altman about how the value of AI will come through AI automating AI research, and that this will happen fairly soon.
No, they don't say that. They are more. I mean, they probably do put a lot of emphasis on that channel, but they also put just generally emphasis on R&D, which is a different thing. So they're saying that AI will mainly produce this value by automating the process of R&D in general. And then it's going to make like a lot of scientific contributions. A paradigmatic example here might be AlphaFold, or you might look at things like AlphaProof for alpha geometry, which is not really doing science, but they tend to be very optimistic. I mean, definitely Dario, he is saying that, oh, like it's going to happen in 2 years. And so I'm clearly saying something else. And you might ask, so why is he so optimistic? I think like Sam has sometimes expressed like views that are like more mixed. Like he has said, oh, like we will have AGI and then it will not be that big of a deal. Like, the world will sort of continue. And, so that's a very different view. And I think Demis is much more excited about applications of AI for science revealed in DeepMind's research priorities. If you look at like AlphaFold was a DeepMind effort, AlphaProof, alpha geometry, those are DeepMind efforts. AlphaGo was a DeepMind effort. So I think AlphaGo is obviously not science, but you can see that it was informed by this view that we need to do this, like we need to do this reinforcement learning thing. And we need the AI that can do complex reasoning and solve like complex problems instead of the sort of more pre-training and post-training and whatever, like the usual training pipeline that's common today. So I think there's a sense in which they are less comfortable with that. But regardless of that, I think there's a general sense that AI for R&D is going to be a big deal. It's not just for AI automating its own R&D, which is also a big deal, I think, according to a lot of these people. But just generally, like how will AI actually impact the economy? And they tend to think in terms of, oh, it will just speed up R&D. I think Demis definitely has this view, and Dario seems to have this view. I'm less sure about Sam because I think he has said things that you can interpret in different ways. But I think there's a sense in which like we disagree with this. In fact, Gate is a model that shows that like Gate doesn't have a general purpose R&D in it. It has software R&D, it has hardware R&D, like it has kinds of R&D that are relevant to AI development, but it doesn't have what you will call like it is not an endogenous growth model in the sense that growth economists would use the term, which would mean that productivity in the general economy increases as a result of research effort or investment. That's just assumed to be either flat or maybe growing at some exogenous rate that's fairly slow. But Gates still produces massive economic impact. So you might ask, well, how does that happen? Well, it's very simple. What happens is that you have all of these AI workers, and that effectively gives you this massive scale up in your effective labor force by like many orders of magnitude. And right now, if you look at the key bottlenecks in the world economy, the key inputs that drive the world economy, the most important one is labor. Labor is paid something like 60 or 65% of all of income as wages. So if you just look at all of gross domestic products or gross world products, and you look at how much of that goes to paying labor, it's like 65%. So it's the dominant contribution. And of the remaining, like 30% is like capital. And capital you can also scale. You can reinvest your output into producing more factories and more machine tools and whatever. So that's also something you can scale. So right now we can't scale labor. We can't reinvest our output to produce more workers. We just have to rely on human population growth. But if we would be able to do this for AI workers, which would enable us to sort of dramatically scale them in a way we can't do for humans, and then you would end up in a world where you have maybe like 1,000 AI workers for each human, let's say. And it's very easy to see how that would produce like a dramatic change in standards of living and productivity and everything. Like, so I think that's the key mechanism that's happening in Gates. And so in that respect, Gate is actually a conservative model because it's not modeling the fact that you would also get this general feedback loop from all this increased capacity and thinking ability and whatever back into productivity. And then that would also increase productivity a bunch, which is not an effect that's more than in Gates. But the point is that effect is actually like most of the effect is actually coming from labor force, because labor force, like that economic output is much more elastic to labor force scaling than it is to R&D. And so that's just the dominant thing. And then R&D thing matters for long run growth. If you don't do any R&D, eventually you will sort of run into the limits of your current technology. Or if you don't do any learning by doing or serendipitous discoveries, whatever. Like if productivity remains flat, eventually you run into the limits of your technology. But like actually most of the economic impact is not coming from the increase in productivity in the sense of like total factor productivity, the way an economist would use the term. It's just coming from this massive scale up. Like one thing you can simply imagine is like imagine everyone has like a household robot in their house, right? Like it's a very simple thing, much simpler than the scale of things you might expect to happen. But already you can see like how convenient and how valuable and how much time like that kind of thing could save. Like a lot of people still have spending time on things like housework, like a special amount of time. And then this might even allow things like maybe if you have these robots, then you don't even need as much space. Maybe you just have this robot that just like rearranges your house depending on whatever you want to do, because you can now afford that. It's like a cheap thing. And in which case you might actually have like a small amount of space in your house that's just enough, because whenever you need to do something else, the robot just like, it rearranges everything and like there's a space for you to do that. You don't have a dedicated space for anything. And you can see like how that might already just be a massive impact just by itself. And then this is only like a tiny piece of what you might expect from the scaling.
So most of the economic growth and most of the value produced by AI will be of that sort, kind of broad automation of tasks throughout the economy, not primarily driven by automating R&D.
Yeah. So what I would say is it's a bit more subtle than that. for long run growth, you need to scale all factors of production at once. So you need to scale capital, you need to scale labor, you need to scale productivity, right? And out of these, the factor that is the most important is labor, and productivity and capital sort of matter like equally about as much, like maybe half as much each as labor or something. And jointly, they matter about as much. I think that's what comes out of the parameter estimates that are typical in the literature for these questions. But you do need to scale all of them at once if you want like very sort of sustained long run growth. And that's what I think will happen. So I don't like, I think we had a newsletter issue about this that I think people just misinterpreted and they didn't understand what we were saying. They thought that we were arguing that R&D is not essential, or like new innovation that increases productivity is not essential for long run growth, which is not what we were saying. It is essential. But you were saying that other things are also essential, like scaling your labor force, scaling your amount of capital. Those are also essential for long run growth. And if any one of those is missing, then you're in trouble. And we were saying that R&D is relatively less important if you compare it to things like capital scaling and labor scaling, because R&D only accounts for a fraction of all productivity gains. Some productivity gains are just from things like learning by doing, which are not like explicit R&D. I mean, you can call that R&D, but in our economy, it's not done by people whose job title is like researcher or academic or whatever. Like it's just done by like normal people. And so it's hard to estimate to what extent people are spending resources on that. And it might come from better management. It might come from just like better, like you figure out better like which inputs to use in your production process. You realize that if you get materials from here instead of there, that's sort of cheaper. You might benefit from economies of scale at the world level, and that would also increase productivity. So all these effects are packed into productivity, and R&D is only accounting for a fraction of productivity growth, which itself is a fraction of overall economic growth, because a lot of it just comes from labor and capital scaling.
Why is R&D not as valuable as economically valuable as people assume?
For long run economic growth, you need to be scaling all factors of production at once. And total factor of productivity is just one factor of production. In the way we think about it in growth economics, labor and capital are also important factors of production. Labor is probably the most important. And then capital and total factor of productivity, if you look at the actual returns that you get when you're scaling them, they seem to be about equally important or something. If you do growth accounting, then what you find is that total factor of productivity growth is only a fraction of long run growth. And the part of that that's driven by explicit R&D instead of things like learning by doing or economies of scale, like you're just more efficient at producing things because you operate on a larger scale, or better management, or better coordination, less misallocation of resources. Like it's just like all of those things going to total factor productivity. So the part of it that's driven by explicit R&D is actually a fraction. So basically, the part of economic growth that's driven by R&D directly is like a fraction of all economic growth. So that it just ends up being fairly small with them compared to what people think, which is that almost all of it is driven by R&D, usually, which is not true. But I think that there's a way in which people can misunderstand this claim, where they will say, well, I mean, if you didn't have any R&D, then like we wouldn't have grown like since whatever, like we wouldn't have our current level of wealth and prosperity compared to like 1700s or something. And yeah, that's true. But that just means that R&D is essential for long run growth. But a lot of other things are also essential for long run growth. Like imagine that we had done R&D since 1700, but we didn't scale our capital stock at all. So, well, we would again be very poor now. So like that's just, so that doesn't mean that just because like multiple things can be essential for long run growth. And labor is also essential because labor actually not only you get to like just directly get a benefit from the increased output, like output just is a big labor elasticity, but on top of that, you get to use labor to drive R&D. Like, you can use the workers, they're researchers, or you can use this big economy that the workers provide you with to make serendipitous discoveries and so on. And well, AI is just going to scale that a bunch as well. So that just seems like a much more relevant channel than narrowly deploying the AIs to do R&D. Like, I think if you have the choice, then it's just much more economically valuable to deploy the AI to do broad labor tasks. And you would also do R&D, I mean, sure. But in the end, all of the factors of production would need to scale for you to be able to get long run growth. But if you again did growth accounting, like you would see that like most of it is coming from the scaling of labor and capital, right? So little is coming from R&D. So I wouldn't expect that trend to change particularly with AI.
Isn't research in machine learning, for example, some of the most economically valuable labor there is right now? So isn't that exactly what you would go after automating first?
Initially, yes. You would go after the things that are paid the most, assuming that your sort of capability distribution is flat. I mean, it's possible that you go after some, like what really matters is how much profit you'll be getting. So it's possible that even though a job is very valuable, it's actually very expensive to do it. So you don't end up deploying the AI to do that. But if you assume that the AI's cost a certain amount and it's just capable of doing any job in the economy, then you would deploy it at the highest compensated jobs. And in fact, this bottleneck is likely to matter at least early on because we actually don't have that much compute worldwide. So if you look at how much compute the human brain uses, it's about the same as one H100. We have like 10 billion people in the world. So that's like 10 billion H100s. We don't have anywhere near that number. We have like maybe 10 million. Like we're off by 3 orders of magnitude. So we have to do some amount of prioritization where we're like, okay, like we have to deploy the AIs in the places where they would be most economically valuable. So this will be probably in the countries where it will be most economically valuable. And then even in these countries, we don't have that much supply of compute to be able to do it like freely. So you'd still be targeting the occupations that have the highest compensation, because that would just make economic sense from the point of view of the labs. And in fact, there is a sense in which even the social value of R&D, which does exist, and as I said, it's like essential for long run growth, even if it's like not literally the most important thing that drives it, it is still a key bottleneck that we need to be able to get past. Even that social value is mostly external, which means that if you're an AI lab, you don't get most of the value from doing that R&D. I mean, software R&D is a bit different because you internalize the value, at least to some extent. I mean, there are multiple competitors, so you don't totally internalize it, but to some extent. But if you're doing like biology R&D or something, like basic research, then you internalize almost none of the value. So even if that is very socially valuable, you would probably still not do it very much, just because you don't internalize the value. But you would just prioritize things that actually do make you money. So like, and that would allow you to actually like increase your valuation and raise more capital and make more money to reinvest more into AI and so on.
One conclusion from looking at your view of broad automation in the economy is that AI will be more salient and it will be more diffuse, it'll be more gradual, and we might notice that AI has improved a lot before it improves even more. So from the perspective of someone who's concerned about the safety of these systems, this is a great thing. We might be able to, we might have longer to respond, and we might have longer to adapt as a society. Is that how you see the most plausible future?
I mean, compared to a world in which you have a software-only singularity inside a single data center, then yes. I think, like in general, the broader the scale of the changes in deployment is going to be, the more you should expect that what happens is not driven by the like idiosyncrasies or like management decisions or whatever of any particular lab, and like the more it's just shaped by the general economic or social or political forces. Like there's just a lot more ability of those forces to operate and control what's happening. And I agree that that's like the most plausible outcome. Now, if you're worried about AI risk, that's not going to necessarily be reassuring to you, because you might think that those forces themselves are going to like make decisions that you don't like. I think it's a bit unclear if you are worried about the safety aspect of it, whether that's actually better or worse. Maybe you're the kind of person who just believes in one lab, like like Anthropic is great, and then like it's good if they like win, and then so it's better if they have this lead, and it's not actually that good if they have to sort of submit to markets and political pressures and like make their systems like the way other people want them to be. But on the other hand, if you're not particularly impressed by the track record of AI safety inside the big labs, then you might actually see this as like a welcome development. Maybe you think this kind of like broader oversight and disciplining forces are going to actually But I mean, people care a lot about safety in other industries. So especially when there's like a visible, like some kind of disaster that happens, some kind of safety failure that happens, safety can just become like a very large priority. So maybe that kind of thing might happen. And in which case this might just be good from your point of view.
I mean, this is not a super developed view, but I do have a sense of if the pace of AI development and the pace of change in the world in general is incredibly high, we just won't have enough time to get our hands around these questions and to understand them in depth and to adapt as a society. And so, if we have a more gradual diffusion of AI throughout society, that might be better. But it's by no means a given, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the division could be broad and it could also be fast. For various reasons, it's like you should expect diffusion to be slower if it's going to be like if it's going to be a broad thing, you should expect development to be somewhat slower because it's just going to be bottlenecked at various points by needs to make things happen in the physical world and dealing with existing social political structures and whatever. And also just need to just accumulate vast amounts of resources, which you might not have to do in the world of a software-only singularity. But at the same time, I think a software-only singularity is actually like that might just end up privileging the, as I said, the idiosyncratic features and views and like practices of some individual lab, which you might just see as not a great outcome. Like it's just a much higher variance thing. In that world, it makes a big difference if OpenAI gets there first, or if XAI gets there first, or whatever, or DeepSeek gets there first, right? But in a world of where it's like a broader thing, then that actually doesn't matter that much. What matters is what are the broader incentives and forces that are like, what are those forces pushing AI to be like? And because people are just going to develop their AIs to sort of be in line with that as much as possible. Now, maybe alignment is hard, so they're going to fail anyway. But even the way they fail is likely to be influenced by what they are trying to do in response to these forces.
Makes sense. So even in the more gradual scenario we're talking about, in which say it takes 20 years or so for AI to diffuse throughout the economy, if you zoom out from any kind of historical perspective, that's still a very short amount of time. You do have some advice for how policymakers can deal with the situation, and you talk about how public perception of AI is likely to shift if we have a more gradual scenario. So policymakers perhaps shouldn't assume that the views held by the public today are the views that matter in a more gradual scenario.
Well, definitely not. I think when AI starts changing things a lot, you should just expect people's views to change. Like when this issue becomes salient. Like a good example is actually COVID. I mean, if you had asked before COVID people for their opinions about like vaccines and vaccine mandates and lockdowns and whatever I mean, it's not clear what they would have told you, but it would not have been very informative regardless of what they said, because it just wouldn't have been a salient issue. It wouldn't have been something they thought about. But once it actually happens and the issue gains like very significant material relevance, then suddenly you see the political circumstance that emerged, they may be very different from what we would have expected in advance. So I think you might just expect something like that when AI actually starts having a lot of impact.
Yeah. What about from a personal perspective, planning for a more gradual kind of AI revolution?
Yeah, and from a personal perspective, I would just say that probably just like saving more and investing more is like a good bet. If this economic transformation goes through, then I expect the marginal utility of income to go up by quite a bit. Like if you already have a certain amount of income today, you can't really get that much more by like having more. Like it's just that there's a certain the scale of our economy and the level of our technology only allow us to produce goods of like a certain variety of goods. And there are a lot of goods or services that we can effectively offer. Like we can offer life extension. We can offer like a lot of services that would improve people's health in ways those are just still very primitive. We can't offer you like very like rich and different like experiences that maybe in the future we will be able to offer you when we like better understand the brain or something. Like I think these are just like like small things. Like there are probably a lot of other variety of goods that are going to come up. Like personally, when I think about the things that I would be most interested in like buying in this like future world, probably the developments in healthcare are the things that like are most exciting to me. And I don't necessarily just mean the obvious things of like treating like life extension and curing cancer and aging or whatever. I think like even aside from that, there are just lots of minor sort of inconveniences and like medical conditions that don't like shorten your life, but that just inconvenience you sort of on a daily basis. It's not like very serious, but like you would probably pay a lot of money to make it go away if like someone had a way to do that.
Oh, absolutely. I would pay a lot to never have the common cold, for example, or to not experience hearing loss as I age. Things like that, which we can't cure now, but maybe we can cure in the future.
That's right. So that's the kind of thing that I was looking forward to. That's the reason why I would also recommend, like, there is a sort of this research done by people on like what should happen to interest rates if people expect AGI. And there's naive arguments you can make that, well, in the future, we're going to be a lot richer. So, I mean, if you think about your own life, like if you don't take into account this massive technological progress or whatever, just think about your own life. If you're going to be much richer in the future, then you have less of a reason to save today because, well, you're going to be rich in the future anyway, and it won't be necessary for you. But with AI, the situation is a bit different. I think the big difference is that the marginal utility of income changes. Like, it's not like you have more money, but just spend on the same things. You have different options to spend money on different things, and that's a big thing. And also, you obviously expect your wages to fall, at least in some future. It's not clear if that happens immediately. It's not clear how fast that happens because there are these competing effects where you do have to compete with the AI workers who sort of, because of diminishing returns to labor and capital, are going to like jointly, like labor and capital jointly, they sort of have some degree of diminishing returns, even if it's not very strong. So if you scale that by many orders of magnitude, you should expect wages to fall. But at the same time, we will also be getting more productive. So how does it wash out? It's not clear. I think in the end, you should expect wages to fall, but that could take a long time. Just not clear how fast that happens.
When you say wages, we should expect wages to fall. Is this a story about unemployment, or is this a story about people literally doing the same work but getting paid less to do so?
I mean, unemployment just means that you don't. I mean, you're looking for a job, but you don't like the offers that are on the market. So, I mean, that is probably what would happen in the sense that people's wages would fall to the point where it is no longer worth it. Like your wages could just fall below subsistence. And then, well, I mean, there's no point in working in that world. Like either you have some wealth or you rely on like various kinds of transfer programs or something, which would be able to give you way more income than you would be able to get just by working. So that's the kind of thing I would expect. But I think it is economically, it's a bit of a complex question. Like, I think it's much easier to predict that eventually wages are going to fall below subsistence than, at least for biological humans, than it is to predict when that will happen. Just because there are these competing effects where as you scale up your capital and labor stock, you hit diminishing returns that lowers the marginal value of those things. And so wages are just the marginal product of labor. So you expect those to fall. But at the same time, that is multiplied by, like, there's an opposing effect because you're going to be getting increased productivity, total factor productivity. And that could well cancel the falling wages you would otherwise expect from diminishing returns, at least up to a certain point. Maybe eventually it doesn't work, but at least up to a certain point. So, like, this eventually is very, like, it's just unclear time scale. It also depends, obviously, on how fast the world economy grows. Because the faster we grow, the faster in some sense we reach the bottlenecks. So if the growth is very slow, then this could take like centuries maybe. But if it's very fast, it's like as fast as we think, then maybe it only takes decades.
The story I've heard from at least some economists is that as AI begins automating a bunch of tasks, the remaining tasks become more valuable. And so they would expect wages to rise for at least a while and then collapse after you reach something like a full automation.
But even after you reach full automation, it's not clear if they're below where they used to be because of this total factor productivity effect. But yeah, otherwise I agree with that story. Like initially, when you get like 50%, 60%, 70% automation, the wages of the people who are still employed are going to be much higher in real terms. And there's going to be a question about to what extent can people reallocate from the tasks that just got automated to the tasks that are not yet automated. And then if they can do that, then you don't necessarily see a lot of unemployment early on. But maybe they can't do that very effectively. Maybe it's not worth it to do that. That's another question. Like if the automation is proceeding very quickly and you need like a year to acquire the skills that are going to make you effective at this new occupation that has not yet been automated, but that thing is going to be automated in a year anyway, then you might not even invest the effort. So you might just like sort of quote unquote give up because it's not going to be worth it, you know.
Yeah, this is perhaps how I've begun thinking about programming and mathematics, that it's probably not worth it for at least myself. It might be worth it for some people, but it's probably not worth it for myself to invest in acquiring these skills just because I expect models to outperform me and to, well, they already are, but I will not catch up before they've gotten much better, would be my mainline expectation.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think there's an extent to which, like, your skills are to some extent a complementary package. So just because models are better at you at X, it doesn't mean the skill X has become not valuable for humans. Just because, like, it might be non-trivial to find a person who has, like, suppose that you have these three skills X, Y, and Z. It might not be easy to find a person who like has the skills Y and Z and can actually use the AI to make up for their sort of shortcoming in X, compared to just a person who has all three skills, and then they can do them as like a package and they benefit from these like synergies and complementarities. So I think that's true to a large extent. Like it's a very so like someone having those skills just makes them more productive in other ways. So I would maybe not be as quite as pessimistic. I would still recommend that you probably like have enough time for learning these things to like pay off. But I think it will pay off in like a somewhat different way than you might expect.
And explain again how is it that it pays off?
Oh, it's just that if you want to hire someone, then it's like much less convenient to hire a person who's good at some other skills, but then is not good at math, but then it tries to compensate for that weakness by using LLMs and to remedy that. But I think like even if LLMs actually become superhuman at math, that still doesn't mean that you don't want to hire for people who are good at math. Just because that like there is a way in which the LLM skill is more difficult to integrate into your normal workflow compared to a person who would just have the same skills, maybe not as good, but it will be a package, part of a complementary package, or with a lot of other skills, many of which the LLM can't do at all right now. So, for example, such a person will probably be more effective at operating the LLM and driving it towards like the results they want. I think this is true right now. Like if you don't know any math, then it's hard to notice, for example, when the LLM sort of makes a mistake.
Yeah. You basically can't evaluate the outputs of the model if you don't know what it's doing.
That's right, and it's just harder to drive it. Like, or for example, if you're using a language model for creative writing, it's hard to like. You need to have good taste in order to be able to say, well, what is a good output, what is a bad output, and like, do I want to change this or do I want to keep this? And even though LLMs are already in some ways like better at writing than most people are, like that's the people who are actually good at it, they still can leverage it and use it as like multiplier, where like they resample a bunch of times and they like recommend edits, and you know they're like, okay, like this doesn't look quite as good. Like, can you redo this part? And so it makes them more productive and not less productive.
When you think about finding out what AI will be able to do in the future, you recommend that we do not look at what AIs can currently do and extrapolate from there. At least perhaps tell us about the difference between extrapolating trends and then thinking from first principles about future AI capabilities.
Right. So extrapolating trends would be like, imagine that you look at AI math capabilities in 2010 and then 2015 and then 2020. And then, well, it doesn't seem like much is happening.
You're basically seeing a flat line and then you're predicting. Yeah. I mean, I just a couple of years ago, I was interviewing AI experts on this podcast about whether large language models would ever be capable in math and in programming and so on, because they were at that point quite lacking in those areas. But now that's obviously changed.
So the point I was making is that extrapolation just doesn't work very well Like, in fact, it doesn't work well in a lot of other ways than that, like very basic ways. For example, in 2015, 2016, it was the era of supervised learning. The tasks that AI was used to do were things like image labeling, image segmentation, predicting who is going to pay back their car loans and who is not going to pay them back. And maybe self-driving cars were maybe the most exciting application because people thought that you could leverage the existing computer vision technologies in order to do them. But so people were predicting maybe that would be the most impactful application of AI in 10 years. It was going to be self-driving cars. Well, I mean, 10 years later, self-driving cars are getting rolled out slowly. We have them in the Bay Area, but like that's just such a small fraction of what actually happened. That's not the story. Like the story is the like LLMs and reasoning models and things that have like some basic like agency capabilities and amazing like document summarization and writing and like question answering, like just natural language processing was basically solved. I think it's difficult for people to today appreciate how difficult people in 2015 thought natural language processing would be to solve. Like it was just considered as a completely intractable problem, or like there have been no progress or almost no progress, and there's no hope. Like it was just like maybe something will happen, but like people had no idea how it would get solved. And then, well, it just got solved by, so I think what happens is, and what you should expect is, well, the brain still has a bunch of capabilities that language models or current models do not, current AI systems. And well, the brain is not like a magical artifact. So those capabilities are actually coming from somewhere. And with each order of magnitude of compute scaling, you first have more training compute. You are able to process more data. Those are very obvious benefits, but also you get to do more experiments, and you are like you have that compute is an input into the process of software R&D, and so you discover ways in which you can like do the things that the brain is doing, and you discover them sort of one by one. Maybe initially it's natural language processing, maybe later it's math and programming, maybe later it's going to be something else. I mean, the brain still has agency and long context and whatever planning capabilities that models seems to lack. But again, like those capabilities are not like out of reach. Sometimes people say that, oh, like language models are never going to be able to do X or something like that. And I think that claim is just not very interesting because, first of all, like are reasoning models like language models? I mean, sometimes people say they aren't because they are part of this like big chain of thoughts, whatever scaffolding, and they might say, well, when I was saying language models are not going to be able to do X, I was just talking about next token prediction or something. And I'm like, okay, but that you see why that's not an interesting claim. Like in this case that you were making that claim, like it's not an interesting claim. So I think what you should expect is that yes, there's going to be changes. I mean, I don't really expect in the next 5 years any fundamental changes, like any big changes in architecture, because the transformer has been surprisingly long living. So I think we should just expect that to continue. But we have seen a lot of changes in how people train transformers. So it's the same architecture, but it's used in very different ways. So we could just well continue to see that. Like we first had the pre-training on next token prediction. I mean, in fact, before we had the pre-training, we had things like first of VS translation, like translate things from English to French. That was the original application of a transformer. And then with things like BERT or whatever in 2018 from Google, the training objectives were like, we give you a sentence and then we mask some of the words and then you predict the held out words. Okay. And then it became next token prediction, the GPT paradigm. And that has stuck. Then we started doing post-training. Like we started doing RLHF. Now we are doing RL, a different kind of RL with reasoning. We have like these synthetic data pipelines where people generate a bunch of synthetic data and train the model on that. And we have long context fine tuning, which is like also a new thing that has emerged maybe the past 3 years or something like that. So we've seen all these changes in how transformers are trained. So I think we should just continue to expect that. And probably that's what the new capabilities that are unlocked are going to be associated with. It's not going to be like people come up with a totally different architecture. It will be more like you come up with a different way to train it on different data using a different kind of signal for RL, or maybe they will find some totally different way of training it. But I think the architecture will continue being stable just because that's just continue to be stable.
Any guesses as to how we might train a transformer so as to get a more agentic model, or a model that's capable of long-term planning, something like that?
I mean, I think the obvious thing is to try to do the thing that led to the original AlphaGo, which is to collect a lot of human data. I'm not sure what this human data would look like, what form it would have to take. It's a bit unclear. And then hope that fine-tuning on that gives you enough traction for some kind of reinforcement learning pipeline to then have enough signal to get working. Like, the problem with doing reinforcement learning naively is that the reward signals might be too sparse. So you might not get anywhere. You need the model to have a certain level of competence from the start for a very naive reinforcement learning approach to work. So that would be my first guess. And maybe that's still going to work. I don't know. Like, I think it's hard to say. Because you could have said that the reinforcement learning was not going to work for complex reasoning, because if it would have worked, then someone would have done it already, but it turns out it works. So maybe you're going to see something similar. The main doubt I have about that is that the human data you collect might not be what you actually need. Like, it might be more like you need the data about what's going on in their brain and not what they are doing externally in their behavior. That's sort of like how it doesn't work to train a reasoning model if you just fine tune it on archive papers, because that's not actually relevant data. The relevant data is probably something that's going on in the head. You don't see that.
That would be pretty difficult to acquire. We don't know how to extract that knowledge. Perhaps is this a game of paying experts to write down their thought process? You can imagine like paying an expert to write down an explicit chain of thought for solving a problem, something like that.
I don't know. I mean, I think that's something I would have tried, but I'm not sure how well it works.
Yeah. Are there any disadvantages to trying to predict AI capabilities by thinking from first principles? So we discussed the disadvantages of extrapolating trends, but what about thinking from first principles?
It's much vaguer in the sense that you can't make as precise capabilities, predictions. But I'm not sure if that's a disadvantage, because maybe you should just be uncertain. Like, I think we just have a lot of uncertainty in any pre-emergence, like, regime on any benchmark, or the benchmark line just looks flat. You just have a lot of uncertainty. I mean, there are methods of trying to deal with it, where you try to reparameterize things. You try to look at things like mean log pass rates instead of looking at accuracy. Like, you try to, or maybe you do partial scoring. You try to just look at what the AI is doing and try to sort of qualitatively assess, or maybe quantitatively assess, how close is it getting to actually being able to do the tasks. Yeah, like, do that for operator and like booking a flight or something. And even there, it looks kind of bad. So, like, how do we assess that? It's not clear. So I would just rely more in that kind of case, like, where like the capability doesn't seem to exist at all. But I think, like, that's not really a problem with the methodology. It's more of that you're just in a difficult situation, and then no method would really do that well in predicting in that situation. Yeah, like, other than that, I think it can be more judgment based. Like, people can just reach different conclusions based on the different priors they have. But again, I think that's just an artifact of the fact that there isn't much evidence as much as we might want. So you just fall back on priors, and which might be different. In fact, even for benchmark extrapolation, I think this comes in because even if there is a trend that you can extrapolate, you don't necessarily know if there's going to be a trend break. Like, that's sort of what happened with math. We were seeing progress in math, but then there was a trend break caused by the reasoning models.
I mean, it seems to me that we lack benchmarks that saturate at an even pace, right? It always seems to be that there's very little progress, and then we reach some new kind of mode and progress, and then the benchmark is basically saturated within a year or so. This has happened with some of the programming benchmarks, some of the math benchmarks, some of the kind of PhD level questions, and so on. But what explains this phenomenon is, and could you, what would a benchmark look like that would kind of saturate at an even pace?
I mean, I think it's an ideal thing, but it's just hard in practice to construct because it's so hard to get a handle on. Like, even if you think you have arranged the questions on like sort of this smooth and even distribution of difficulty, well, that doesn't mean that it's gonna get saturated and like it's gonna get solved in like an even way. It might just be that AI just acquires the capability suddenly, and then there's a new paradigm, and then people scales all of a sudden, and then you make a ton of progress. So I think it's just very hard to anticipate that when you're designing a benchmark. But I think there is an answer to the question of why do benchmarks get saturated so quickly. I think it's because people only build a benchmark when solving the benchmark appears to be like in sight. So they don't make a benchmark that's completely impossible, like for an AMO. Like we don't make a benchmark about, okay, like can GPT-4 like cook me a meal? Okay, yeah, that's not a benchmark. That doesn't exist because it would be pointless. It get zeros, and then we keep getting zeros for many years, so that would be pointless. But we can already imagine a benchmark about, okay, like can GPT-4 do like computer use tasks reasonably well? Like OS World is kind of like this. Except OS World tasks are very narrow and specific. You can imagine like a more general benchmark about that. And well, the fact that you just sort of imagine that benchmark probably means that's going to happen. Like you're imagining it because it seems plausible to you that that might happen on some level. And also, labs also pay for benchmarks when they think the payoff is going to be fairly soon. So there's also an economic selection where like the benchmarks that get lab funding are the benchmarks that labs expect are going to be useful in the near term. That is not just useful for like demos and making their models seem impressive, but also for internal evals. Like if every single model always gets zero on a benchmark, then you get like no useful internal signal for your decisions about what to do internally. But if you need some variation in the model performance, and that means the models already have to be somewhat competent at tasks that are you see in the benchmarks. So I think that's a lot of what's going on.
You wouldn't expect us to ever get to the kind of this dream benchmark where you would see this kind of smooth performance over time.
No, I mean maybe that would happen, but I think it would be like by accident. Like, I think it's hard to design that in advance.
Okay, let's talk about Moravec's paradox. You have a great post on this where you kind of update Moravec's paradox. So tell us what is Moravec's paradox and what is like a modern update on how to explain it.
Right. So Moravec's paradox is the observation that perception and sensory motor and skills are much more computationally expensive and difficult than the skills that typically seem to us to be associated with intelligence, like playing chess or whatever. It's a very old observation. The basic explanation that Moravec himself gave for the paradox is that the capabilities that seem difficult to us are the capabilities that are new and not very well optimized in us. So playing chess, well, humans were not selected for their ability to play chess. So we can have vast variations in the efficiency with which we play chess. For example, if you look at the point at which AI systems, computers, reached sort of medium strength, like amateur strength in chess, like 1200, 1300 ELO, that was around, and then you, like we were using a certain amount of compute there. Then you look at how many orders of magnitude of scaling we had to do until we reached the level of the world champion, which is around 2800 ELO. We had to do around 5 orders of magnitude of physical compute scaling and also a bunch of software progress. So if you look at it naively, that says that the human range in chess playing ability is like at least like more than 5 orders of magnitude wide, because that's even median to right tail. Like, and then there's left tail, which is maybe even worse. Maybe it's some orders of magnitude worse. And then you're saying, well, that doesn't like. Imagine you had like 6 orders of magnitude of variation between people and how fast they could run. Like that would be very strange. Like that would not be something you would expect. I mean, we say some people run faster than others. Yeah, we mean like they'll run like twice as fast or 3 times as fast. We don't mean they run like a million times as fast.
So in physical tasks, if you have a bunch of able-bodied people, you don't expect a lot of divergence in performance, say, between me loading a dishwasher or you loading a dishwasher, which is a task that's incredibly difficult for, I mean, basically impossible for current robots and AIs to solve. But in something like advanced physics research, programming, and so on, you see an incredible difference in performance between people. Because the more theoretical, the more mathematical, and the more kind of technical tasks it's something that we didn't evolve to do, and it's something that we've only been doing for, call it, the thousands or hundreds of years.
That's right. And the point is that if doing a task was very valuable in the evolutionary environment, and it has been valuable for a very long time. That's also important. Then there's just been a lot of selection pressure applied. And the way in which those capabilities are instantiated or implemented in the human brain, the algorithms that are used to do those things are very sophisticated. Like you don't get a lot of like trained parameters or whatever from evolution just because the DNA just doesn't contain that much information. So DNA only contains enough information to really code for like an algorithm and like high level details. It doesn't contain enough information to like you can't view evolution as analogous to a training run. Like and then the results go into your brain because there isn't that much information that you actually get in the genome. But you can view it as analogous to as the algorithm and architecture search. And in that case, the algorithm and then the algorithms are very separate. Like the brain has different regions that are responsible for different things. Like it has a cerebellum, which is like has its own responsibilities that are separate from the rest of the brain, and it has like specific areas devoted to visual processing and audio processing, sort of general purpose thinking tasks, which happens more in the prefrontal cortex. It has specific areas devoted to language understanding and parsing. So these are all very regional, and probably they're just all done by different kinds of algorithms to some extent because they are regional and they're the same areas in everyone. So it has to be sort of coded in the genome somewhere. That's how it has to happen. But the capabilities that are just very new, well, those haven't been optimized very much. So they're probably just being done by like a fairly crappy algorithm. And in that case, because it's not been optimized, there's a lot of room to improve the efficiency with which you make use of the resources of the brain, like its power usage and its computational power to just get better performance on the task. So chess is like this. And in these tasks, you just see a lot of variation, like just training to do tasks more can improve your performance dramatically. There's a lot of genetic variation in performance, maybe because of underlying skills, maybe just for reasons you don't understand. Like you might have better memory. Like some people just have better memory than other people. You might have more of an ability to visualize and calculate things that might matter in chess. But yeah, so if you just stack all those up, you end up with this 5, 6, whatever order of magnitude difference in efficiency with people play chess. But that just means chess is an easy skill. Like you should. I mean, it's not necessarily easy, but like there's no reason to expect the humans are particularly good at it. Humans are actually probably just bad at it, and so a computer can just beat us. Well, that's not surprising because we haven't been quote unquote selected to be good at that task. But for the tasks that we have been good at, selected to be good at. So things like complex object manipulation, which appears to be something that there's a very little variation in between different humans, so suggests that capability was fairly optimized. Or sensory motor tasks more generally. Like obviously it's very important to be able to do visual processing. That's just a very important skill. Even animals are very good at visual processing in many different cases. In fact, some animals are better than humans at like very specific tasks, like cats have a faster visual reaction time and things like that. Well, so that skill's very old.
Yeah, so basically the tasks that intuitively feel very difficult for us are not the tasks that are actually difficult in some sense. If you ask me to memorize 100 or a million different digits, that's something I won't be able to do no matter how hard I train, but it's utterly trivial for a computer. If you ask a current robot to pour water into a glass and drink from it and then put the glass on the table, that's something that almost every human can do, but basically no robots can do yet. So what's interesting here is that our intuitions about which tasks are difficult are kind of turned upside down. And so what does this tell us about which tasks or jobs might be most vulnerable to automation?
A job having a physical component is a reason to expect it to be automated later. A job requiring a lot of agency and complex planning over long contexts, long horizons, where the feedback loops are kind of unclear. I think that's also a reason to expect it to be automated later. At the same time, a job having vast differences in human performance is a reason to expect to automate it early. But I think sometimes these things can get mixed up in the sense that there might be a job which depends on complementary skills. And some of those skills are things that are like easy for AIs to do. But then some other skills might be hard. So for example, you might need, so to be a math researcher, you might need a bunch of math like knowledge and skill. but you might also need some kind of complex agency, which is harder for AIs. So, like compared to a very trivial job where the context lengths are very short. Like a very good example might be like customer support, where like the context lengths are fairly short. Customer support is maybe like something we might be social interaction is something we might be optimized for more than we are for math. But at the same time, the context length of that task is very short.
Yeah, it's quite modular. It might be a 2 5 minute call, and then there might be a script for it, and so on.
That's right. So I think it's difficult to do this analysis at the level of jobs, just because a lot of jobs mix a lot of different skills together. But you can do the same kind of analysis, like as in the paper. Like there's paper GPTs are GPTs. I don't know if you know this paper.
Maybe explain to our listeners the two different meanings of GPT in that title.
So the first GPT is just generative pre-trained transformer. It's like, the name of the model family of GPT-2, GPT-3, GPT-4. And the second one is general purpose technology. So they're saying that the basic thing they do in the paper is they look at how exposed different occupations in the economy are to being automated by LLMs, maybe partially automated by LLMs for the most part. And they try to quantify, okay, like what are the things about an occupation that predicts whether it will be easy or hard to automate. I think you can do the same kind of analysis where you can say, like something requiring a lot of agency, a lot of complex planning, a lot of sort of creativity and adaptation to like new circumstances is the reason to expect it to get automated later. A task requiring like advanced sensory motor skills is a reason to get expect automation later. And on the flip side, a task being like sort of modular and well contained and not sort of like being the kind of thing that you can just outsource to a contractor very easily. And the contractor works on it for like 2 days and then they get back to you. I think that's the kind of thing that's actually easy to automate because that is a very circumscribed task. It means you don't actually need a lot of complex planning to do the task. You don't need integration into a very large context. You don't need like to be on board on a company and like be familiar with how they do things, and like none of that is necessary. Like there's just packaged narrow task, it's handed out to someone, and then they do it. And that's kind of tasks that I think that's kind of labor tasks, which I think we will see the AIs automate. I think we're already seeing this right now. Like for example, you can imagine the kind of request you send, the deep research being this kind of thing. Like you just hire someone and then you tell them, okay, like write me a report on like such and such. And then they like write you a report and get back to you. Like that's the thing you can easily imagine outsourcing to a contractor. While I think the jobs that you would in the current economy struggle to outsource to a contractor because it's just extremely annoying and it's very tied up with your own business practices and your context. And it's just an extremely long project. In that case, I think AI will struggle much more to do it. I mean, to be clear, like eventually I think all of these are going to get solved. But if you're talking about the relative order in which things will get automated, I think this is roughly a prediction I would make.
Yeah. You also write about how software engineering and math research is kind of vulnerable to automation, or at least part of it will be. And this is for the reasons we've already discussed. We have a bunch of data, and this is something that's very difficult for most humans to do. There's a wide range of performance, and so you would expect automation of particularly those tasks, or specifically those tasks.
Before the others, yes, but still, like it's not entirely trivial to automate software engineering because it, like in practice, software engineering is not these like short snippets of tasks. It usually it's a longer context thing than that. Usually it's like vague instructions, and you need to be familiar with what the company is doing to be able to do your job properly. And that is something that's going to be, I think, trickier. It's going to be more difficult.
But doesn't it also, I mean, some software engineering might be kind of more modular, and
so that part should get automated.
Yeah, more outsourceable and so on. But the parts that require large contexts or kind of context from specific companies would be automated last, in your view.
Yep.
One interesting point you also made is that you expect high-level management to also be automatable. This one surprised me a bit because, I mean, management is mostly about people. It seems like something humans are quite good at, and most humans are quite good at, like social interaction, talking, and so on.
But LLMs are also good at social interaction.
Yeah, in some sense, yeah, that's true.
So the important thing to keep in mind is that social interaction is a skill that faced a lot of selection pressure, but it is not a very old skill. So you should expect it to be quite a bit easier than the sensor motor tasks for that reason. Like this is like much newer. And management is again like it's a complementary thing. I don't say actually that management is gonna get automated because I think management does have this, but I say that a lot of what people do in management is probably gonna get automated. So you're gonna have managers who experience like a big increase in productivity. And maybe also we'll start selecting managers on somewhat different skills because some of the things we today expect them to do good at, they will no longer need to be good at to the same extent. But the reason management is like such a new skill is because you're doing it at an unprecedented scale. Like the management that is even like an old skill is like managing like a group of 5 people to like I don't know forage or something. Like that's the skill that's old. Like managing a company of 100,000 people spread across the world. That's not an old skill.
That's not something we evolved to do at all.
That's right. And again, people differ like so enormously in their abilities to do management. Like if you look at like in fact, like typical person, if you put them in charge of a company, like of any meaningful scale, they would probably be destructive. They would add negative value to the company. They would sort of interfere with what the company is doing in harmful ways, and they will sort of mess things up. I think it's like very natural to expect. And then you have this variety of people who are just extremely effective at doing it. And the question is, okay, like if there's such vast variation, again, that's just generically a reason to expect that the task, there's at least a big component of that task that is easy for AIs. That doesn't mean the entire task is easy for AIs, because again, management does require this like long context understanding and things like that, which I think are loading on human skills that are older. But you would just try to outsource. Like you would try to get the AI to automate as much of your work as you can, especially the parts that rely on like these newer skills that you don't actually want, like you're not actually that good at. And that might improve the quality. That's sort of the thing I expect. I think, in fact, even if AIs would be capable of substituting for human managers, I think we would probably stick with human managers for at least a while.
For social or political reasons.
Legal reasons as well. I mean, you want someone to be liable for decisions, and it's easier if it's a human compared to if it's an AI. But yeah, also for social reasons.
What about data? We don't really have good data on on management, right? So that might also slow things down here.
But humans also don't have good data.
Yeah, that's also true.
So like that's the I mean, AIs remain less data efficient than humans. So we need more data if you want to teach something to an AI. But at the same time, like if humans are bad enough, then like maybe you don't even need that much training data to do like a better job than humans. The question is, how would you even find out if this is the case? Because management is not something you can like have a good benchmark for. Like you need to actually convince people to like show up and like work for you. And I mean, it just seems difficult to convince people that this is actually the case. It's the kind of capability that might emerge, and then people might only realize that AI has this capability like significantly later. But I think like people will be trying to find ways to just integrate AI into their workflow, and probably that's the channel. That's the way in which it's going to happen. Like it's not going to happen by like AI labs saying, "Oh, okay, we're going to replace like management." It's going to be more like managers themselves, especially ones who are like more familiar with the technology, are just going to start using it more, and they're going to like notice that it just benefits them. And like one very simple thing is that a manager just has to read a lot of stuff potentially, and you can already imagine like a very competent AI just speeding that up enormously. Like you're like, okay, like what is this? Like just find this information in this document and like check this for that. Or like they're very simple things, which to an AI are very simple, but to a human would just be time consuming. That you can just outsource to an AI. That could be one.
What do you expect for AI this year? So in 2025?
Yeah, I still expect progress to be faster this year than last year, mostly because of the compute scaling we're going to be seeing this year. And I think the pre-training scaling is only part of it, and we're already starting to see that. But it's also the fact that people are going to be scaling up the reasoning thing. I also expect possibly we're just going to see something new, like similar to reasoning models. I think there's a decent chance of that by end of year. I can't predict what it's going to be. But I expect it, like each order of magnitude of scaling, I expect there's like a good chance you unlock something new. So I sort of like, and if you're seeing them, that's roughly the amount of scaling this year compared to that last year, because all the big clusters of the H100s are coming online. I expect math progress to continue. Maybe like our own math benchmark, frontier math, I think we might see like 75% by end of the year on that benchmark. I think SweBench is going to get saturated.
Explain to our listeners how kind of wild these statements are. What is frontier math? What is SweBench? Just to give some context on these are fairly hard benchmarks, and you would expect them to get saturated.
Yeah, frontier math is the benchmark that we created in collaboration with OpenAI. It consists of math problems that are like at least like an order of magnitude harder than you had in previous math benchmarks, and maybe even more. Maybe like the harder questions are maybe even like 2 orders of magnitude harder, if in terms of like how long it would take an expert human to solve them. They also require like specialized domain knowledge for the harder questions. Maybe a way to put it is like maybe like 25% of the benchmark you can do like in like a person who has a like competition background in math could do like in 30 minutes. Maybe the median question is like you would take an hour or 2 hours. And then the hardest questions would be even longer, and they would also require more background. So the current state-of-the-art score in our own evaluations is something like 11%. OpenAI has their own internal evaluations where they report much higher scores. But those are for models that have not been released to the public. So it's either models like O3, which have just not been released at all, or it is which OpenAI said got 25%, or it's models like O3 mini high, but it's evaluated probably with much larger inference budgets and some kind of custom internal scaffolding that OpenAI doesn't actually expose to external users, with which they claim to get around 30%. In our own evals, where we just evaluate the models as they exist, like if you just subscribe to OpenAI and you go to their API or something, and then you just pick O3 mini high, and then we have our own custom prompting and so on, and we give the model access to tool use. But I think our way of giving access to tool use is probably not as sophisticated and not as performant as OpenAI's is. So yeah, like that's what frontier math is. Yeah, like I think 75% on that benchmark is quite an impressive score, but I don't think it's like unreasonable. I think it's in line with other people expect as well. It's just because we like reasoning RL is such a new paradigm, and it's still not nowhere near being saturated. Unlike like in the sense that people are still spending quite a bit less on it, like maybe 10x or more less on it than they are on pre-training. So there's still a lot of room for them to scale this up. There's room for them to do it on more performant-based models. Like they could do a reasoning thing based on 4.5. Like we could see that GP5 comes out and it's going to be this mixture of many different things. And maybe one thing is that it has this reasoning capability on top of like a much bigger base model, and that gives it much better performance. I would not be surprised by that. SweBench is a benchmark designed on the ability of AI systems to resolve actual GitHub issues. I think the main thing that separates SweBench, I mean, there are some other things as well, but it ties into what I said earlier about context windows. Like most issues, you can resolve them without having like that much context. Like you do need to know something about the project, but it's not like you need to be onboarded on a company and then spend 6 months at the company and interpret some vague instructions. It's usually a lot clearer than that. So that's why I expect to get like solved. I think we've already seen a lot of progress on SweBench. So right now, the state of the art on SweBench verified, which is like a split, which has sort of been human validated to be like high quality. Not more difficult necessarily, but I mean, just like validated so that it doesn't have errors. The current state of the art is like 65%. So I expect like 90% or something to just get saturated by end of year. I think that's like a very reasonable prediction if you look at the pace of improvement we've seen. And I expect OpenAI's revenue estimates are probably going to be just about accurate. So OpenAI estimates on the order of like $10 billion of revenue, maybe $11 billion. I don't remember the exact number, by like this year. So in the year 2025. And I think that's probably about right. Like maybe they get 12 billion. That seems right. So that would be 3 times more than what they got last year. And then last year was 3 times more than the year before that. So it was like 1.2 or whatever billion dollars in 2023. Then it was like $4 billion in 2024. So now we're expecting like $12 billion.
That's fantastic growth. You mentioned that of course, you can't predict what the next kind of breakthrough would be, a breakthrough in the same vein as reasoning models. Do you want to speculate on that? Do you have some ideas?
The most plausible to me looks like some kind of long context breakthrough. I mean, I'm hoping that happens, but I'm also kind of skeptical because it's been this thing where people have been saying it's going to happen for a very long time, and then it keeps not happening.
What would it mean to have very long context? What would that allow us to do?
It would currently the models just like their performance degrades quite a lot if you try to use them in any kind of longer context. It's not just about the context window limits that you see. Like, okay, we can only handle 200,000 tokens in one context. Like that's fake. They can't handle 200,000 tokens like without loss of performance. And the benchmarks they have for testing long context performance are very narrow. It's things like needle and haystack evaluations, where you just have to find some specific thing in a long passage of text. But the actual thing that matters more is like, if I give you a long document, then how much do you hallucinate about it? How much do you understand if like there are different parts of it that are interacting with each other? If you just talk with a language model over, like, for example, you can have it write a story for you. That's a good way to test its capability. You will notice that even after you get past like tens of thousands of tokens, low tens of thousands, its coherence and ability to like understand what's going on, ability to recall details and make inferences based on what has been written in a past context starts getting worse. I don't know like how this will be solved. Maybe it's just going to be solved by fine tuning on more long context things. Like I'm not sure what is going to be the key thing, but it just seems like a big issue because like long context is required for unlocking a lot of economically valuable applications. Even 200K context is actually not that long. That's not enough, for example, to fit a good chunk of Harry Potter books or something. That you can fit a single book into context. And so then that just makes it much more annoying to use. If these models had tens of millions of tokens of context and they actually like could do that without noticeable loss in performance, and maybe also not like a steep increase in price, which is what you might get today if you try to do that because of the complexity of attention. Like that, I think would just be valuable and would unlock a lot of other economically valuable applications because once you have a model that's like really performant at long context, you might be able to train it much better to use that long context for other things like reasoning. So I just like that just seems like a very relevant bottleneck to me. If they could just find a way to unlock that, I think that would be very valuable. Another possibility is that people make some kind of like agency gets quite a bit better, but I'm not sure.
Would those two be related? So context, kind of having a large context might make you a better agent?
I mean, I think, yeah, having a large context is necessary to be a good agent. It's not sufficient, but
yeah. As a last question here, maybe you could talk about the kind of extremes of what you'd expect on timelines. So we've talked about how you're more skeptical on about 5-year timelines than the leaders of the AI companies. And maybe your median scenario is something like we will see increased automation over the next 20 years. What kind of evidence would you need to see in order to be convinced that, say, we'll get AGI by 2030? And in the other direction, what kind of evidence would you need to see to say, okay, we're not getting AGI until 2100?
for 2100, I think it's tricky. I think probably I would need to see like a long time with like scaling basically not working very well. Maybe like 5 years or more, maybe 10 years. And then I would probably update towards that. For before 2030, I think if I saw like a lot of, first of all, I would want to see breakthroughs in the capabilities that I mentioned before. Like I want to see some kind of clear trend that I can extrapolate, or like these things are clearly getting much better. These things which they've always been bad at, like agency, long context, sensory motor skills, and complex planning and execution, that kind of thing. I'm not sure. Like if I saw that happening, then I would update. But I'm not sure if I would update all the way to before 2030. That would depend on the rate at which it's happening. I mean, definitely if I suddenly saw like a breakthrough in robotics,
That would be a big deal.
that would be a big deal, yeah. But do I expect it to happen? No, I don't expect like a big breakthrough in robotics for the until 2030.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for chatting with me. It's been great.